you hear me in the back? For those of you who might not know me, my name is Jacque Clements. I am with the Association of Indiana Counties. I am a former county recorder, a former county auditor in 2 different counties, and a former state legislature, and now I work for the Association of Indiana Counties. I hate to tell you, when I started back in the auditor's office, my first job in the courthouse was in the auditor's office. It was in 1979, January of 1979, I went to work in the auditor's office. And I've been either working in government or working for a company that services government since that time. So 40 years now. I was just a baby. Okay, today we're going to go over just a few things briefly here on, and for those of you who have been in office and are reelected, you're going to be very familiar with this. For those of you who are new, hopefully you'll take something away from this and that will be helpful to you. Turn it on. Ha. So appropriations. Appropriations are the authority to spend the funds. In most instances, you must have an appropriation before you can spend. And that is, I give you the IC code there that states that the money must be appropriated by the county council before it's spent, unless otherwise provided by law. And you can find a list of some of the exceptions, not all of them. You can find those in the Auditor's Manual, page 814. I think it's still the same. I think I checked it up, and that's the newest link to it out there on the web page that gives you those funds that can be spent without appropriation. Title 4D incentive funds are without. Clerk's record perpetuation funds are without, and there are a list in there. So there may be some others out there. Just know that, read the statute that creates the fund, and it will tell you whether the money does not have to be appropriated. If it doesn't say that it can be spent without appropriation, it must be appropriated. So when an appropriation comes about is when an administrative officer, whether it be the elected official or a department head, needs to have an appropriation. They must request it. Oh, I forgot to do my joke first. Can I stop a minute and do my joke? I'm sorry, I'm sitting here playing with my ball. I was told earlier today not to be boring, not to be, to make sure that nobody was falling asleep. Don't be boring, Jackie, that they're going to fall asleep. I said, okay. I said, but I don't know any good jokes. So he said to me, well, you know, I attended a class one time, and the speaker had a ball, and it had a string on it. And they told me that if that speaker saw me fall asleep or anyone fall asleep, they were going to throw the ball at him. So that's what this green ball is here. If I see you and your eyes are asleep, I'm going to throw it at you. And trust me, I'm not a good thrower, so. So back to what we're here for. So once the administrative officer has requested it, it must be approved by the county council, and then it's overseen by the commissioners. And when I say overseen, they're the ones that agree to the expenditure out of that appropriation. So exceptions from those things that need to be appropriated, like in county general, would be an insurance reimbursement in an insurance fund. The statute provides that if something is damaged and you get a check from the insurance company and you're going to use that check to fix that property that was damaged, you don't need to appropriate that money as long as you're spending it to fix that property that was damaged. You can't put it in the line item and then fix, like a sheriff's vehicle. You can't fix another sheriff's vehicle. You got to fix the one that you received the money for. Reimbursements for state and federal grants. Federal grants that are received as an advance do not require an appropriation, and they should have a detail in the grant of where that money can be spent. One of the reasons why it's so important that when somebody within your county is requesting from the commissioners the opportunity to receive grant money, you get a copy in your office. You need a copy of those grants so you know whether they're advanced grants or they're reimbursable grants, whether they're state or federal. So state grants are supposed to be appropriated. However, per Lori's slide in the last meeting we were in, the State Board of Accounts will not take exception if the grant has a detailed budget in the grant agreement. Okay? And then, right. Doesn't have to be office paper, pencils, stationery. It just has to be the different categories, the 4 different categories, what they can spend it on. So then reimbursable grants must be appropriated before you can spend from a reimbursable grant, because you're spending that money before you get it. The other exception that we have out there are erroneous or excessive disbursements. So if you've overpaid an invoice for whatever reason and they send you back payment from that invoice, you can put that payment back into the appropriation. It does not need to be additional appropriated. In the same budget year. And that is on the screen here too. In the same budget year. So if you paid it this year and it doesn't come back till next year, it just goes receipts into the fund that it was expended from, and it's cash that can be appropriated. Okay? And then a refund without appropriated money erroneously received. So if you received a refund that you weren't supposed to get, you can write that payment back to repay that refund. If you have any questions through this, please let me know. Okay, so before money can be dispersed from a fund, you need to consider that there's sufficient appropriations in place and that the balance is in the fund for that expenditure. So it doesn't matter if someone has an appropriation of $50,000, but there's only $25,000 cash. You can only spend up to the amount of cash that's in that fund. And then you're anticipating the rest of that revenue to come in before the end of the year that can be expended from that appropriation. Most appropriations are established during the annual budget process, and under that process, the appropriations must be established for a year not to exceed your maximum levy plus the miscellaneous revenues you're going to receive, and you'll learn that kind of in the budget process as you go along. There are reports where you can track these appropriations, and I just listed the 2 major software vendors that we have. Guts is out there, and I'm not sure what the name of their report is, and then there are other counties who may have single ones, but these are the reports where you can track those appropriations. I also would recommend that along about mid-year, you start handing this report to the department heads out there so they can track their appropriations themselves also. I mean, you are the kind of the overseer of all of this, but it's their responsibility to know that when they're going to expend money, that they have enough money appropriated for that expenditure. So if you once a month give them a budget status or a summary of balances and accounts object location report, they can look at that and see, oh, gee, I'm going to be needing some supplies here and there's nothing there, and get the transfer done early or additional request done early before it's the last minute. I've got to have this paid and there's not enough appropriation. So starting about mid-year is when I would start giving that to them. If an appropriation is not sufficient, you have a couple of ways that you can take care of it. A transfer of appropriation, and you can transfer within a budget classification with no prior council approval. But if it goes from one classification to another, it must be approved by the county council. Transfers can only be made within a department, and if needed from one department to another, then you must do a reduction of appropriation and an additional appropriation to do that. You cannot take money from the clerk and give it to the sheriff, or take an appropriation from the clerk and give it to the sheriff. You need to reduce one and then do an additional. And the reduction of an appropriation works exactly like the additional process does, the advertising and the resolution or ordinance, whichever you use. So if an appropriation is not sufficient and you want to do an additional, it must be requested by the department head. The auditor must check to ensure sufficient funds are available. And there, I'm going to show you a little worksheet here in just a minute that will kind of be an assistance for that. You must notice the public meeting 10 days prior to the meeting, and it must be approved by the county council in a public meeting by resolution or ordinance. They can't just come into your office and say, oh, that's okay, go ahead and pay it. The answer to that's no. Reductions of appropriations are handled in the same manner as the additionals, and they may be done for a couple of different reasons. They may be done to allow for appropriation that's needed in another department, or it may be done just to reduce spending. There may be some reason in your county that when you were estimating budgets in the budget process the previous year, revenues fell off. Maybe in one county we had the instance where the county sheriff stopped bringing in DOC inmates, and so that revenue just plummeted. And so we were going to have a shortfall in the budget process. So they went through with the help of the elected official and asked for some reductions within their department so they could do a reduction of appropriation, knowing that the revenue they were anticipating wasn't going to come in. This is kind of little, and I hope you can see it on your sheets. But this is that sheet I was telling you how you can kind of work to make sure that there's enough revenue to cover the appropriation that someone is requesting, because there's no need to spend that money advertising that additional if the revenue isn't there. And this now is something that is, I think the DLGF is going to have this on their webpage shortly after the first of the year. When you do additionals, it would be this very same information going in. But this is a little worksheet that you can set up and have it so that you can put the amounts in, and it would calculate and make sure that there's enough money down on line 17 on the surplus funds remaining line that says, yes, we can advertise for that additional, or no, we can't. And I always did this very first thing when it was brought in. That shows you where you can find that information to fill the sheet out. Any questions?
Is there a way that we can get this that is a little bit larger?
I can. I will send it out. I will send actually what I copied and pasted into here.
Because I didn't bring my magnifying glass.
I know it's little. I can do that. I will send it out to all of you. I know, I can just barely read it on the screen. It's probably better, more legible up there. Pardon? It pretty much is, yeah, it's the same sheet that you use when you do an additional. But I always did it ahead of time. I did it the minute the request came in. I didn't wait until the council approved it and then filled this sheet out and realized there wasn't enough money. Okay. Correct. Right. And I think you can download that additional appropriation worksheet off of the webpage. I'll get that information too, and it's a Excel spreadsheet out there that you can use, that you can't change the formulas in certain places, but it would work just the way we're working. What I wanted to show most is where you got that information to do this prior to when you were advertising and taking it to the council. So this is the budget order page that you would get some of that information from. And I gave you the second page because when you're working with the Department of Local Government Finance, their fund numbers and your fund numbers are very well not going to be the same, because probably your financials have fund numbers that are more related to the State Board of Accounts, and their numbers are different. And I gave you a place where you can find the ones that they're using for tax-driven funds on this page. it lists their fund number and the fund name. Like their highway, this one is 0702, but their highway is 0706, but you're going to be probably using 1176 in your funds ledgers. So I was just kind of giving you some information there. So encumbrances. Encumbrances are those expenditures that are expended this year that aren't going to get paid for until the ensuing year. And that'll happen a lot in December. They must be approved by your county council. You must have an invoice or a contract that is dated prior to December 31st of the current year. And there must be enough money in the current year appropriation to move forward. If there's not, you can move either the amount of the contract or invoice that's still left due and owing, or the amount of the appropriation, whichever is less. You can't move more than what's already in that current appropriation. Now, if you're planning ahead of time, you can, and you don't wait until the next year, you can transfer in the current year to get enough in that appropriation if you have the ability to do that. But you can't do that next year. You can't come in January and say, gee, I wished I would have transferred money back here in December because it's too late. Yes. No. It stays right. All you're doing is transferring the appropriation. You're not transferring any money. You're only encumbering and moving forward that appropriation, and your software systems will have an adjustment that's called encumbrance, so that you can tell the difference between your encumbrance and your additional appropriations. Those also, you need to make sure that you keep a list of those, and they should be done by resolution or ordinance, whichever your county uses, because come budget time, when you get ready to start your budgets, that's one of the first things your field rep is going to ask you for is a list of your encumbrances for the current year. The encumbrance that you encumber forward also can only be spent for the invoice or the contract that it was encumbered for. And I'm going to give you a simple little story and to kind of help you. We had a need for a new roof on the county home. And so in November, we went out and took quotes and accepted a quote for the county home and had a contract for repair of the county home roof, but the weather turned bad, so we didn't get it done in the current year. So come January, we encumbered that money forward, or the appropriation forward, for that county home roof repair. Well, the weather still was bad, and by February, the person who was going to do it did not have time, and so the commissioners wanted to spend that appropriated encumbered money on a different vendor and a different invoice. It was the same amount of money, but it was a different vendor and a different invoice, and they couldn't do that. We had to eliminate the encumbrance and do an additional appropriation because it must be spent for the invoice or contract that it is encumbered for. So, expenditure of the claims, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I'm going to just kind of sail through these because these are the duties of each of the different steps of the claim. When a claim comes into you, it's that department head's responsibility to have that claim, however you do it, whether you do it electronically or whether you do it on paper, that is presented to you ready for you to audit and pay. It needs to have that original invoice. It needs to have the appropriation they wanted expended from, and the amounts on that invoice should be calculated at the rate either by a bid or a contract if it's such, or whatever's on the invoice needs to be on that claim voucher. That's their responsibility, not your responsibility to do all their work for them. So then your responsibility is to make sure that that invoice is original. And I know I had the question posed to me at the commissioners conference, what happens if the invoice is sent to me via email? And I said, if it's sent to you via email, you need to do something that marks it. There needs to be a policy set between the auditor and you on how you're going to determine that that is the original invoice, so that somebody doesn't come along with another copy of it and then try to pay the copy. If they send it to you and it's in color, by all means try to print it on a color printer. But you want to make sure, because it does happen. It does happen. They're paid twice, and then you've got these refunds coming back that you don't really want to mess with. I mean, you do, but if you don't pay it the second time by not using the original. So, and then it's your responsibility to audit the claim to make sure it matches that invoice. If it's via a contract, it's to make sure it's within the stipulations of the contract. Once you have verified it, you sign it. And then you prepare the claim docket for the Board of Commissioners of their approval. After they approve it, then you issue checks. Can't issue checks before, and they can't rechange after they've approved it, because you've got the check out the door. And then the responsibility of the commissioners then is to review all of those claims. And I will say, if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, you have a question on, question that other elected official. Obviously, you want to do it in a way that's not going to offend them, but ask them. If you're not sure why they purchased something, ask them why. And if you get no answer and you're still concerned with that, or you don't have a good working relationship with that other elected official, then give a heads up to your Board of Commissioners. I mean, there's no way they can look through all of the claims. They should. We used to look at everyone and sign everyone, but that's not the way the process works now. And so if there's something that triggers you a doubt or you think might not be quite right, by all means, let that Board of Commissioners know. You're kind of their second set of eyes on that. Once they've passed it, they'll sign the docket. And if they sign a docket, they no longer have to sign all the claims. If they don't sign a docket, then they sign all the claims. But I think most are using dockets now. And the Board of Commissioners do have the right to audit all of the county funds. Unfortunately, at any point in time, and they often want you to stop what you're doing to help them, but they do have a right to audit all the funds. So there's a couple other things that I found that were quite helpful to me when I was in the auditor's office that I wanted to pass along to you. And the biggie one is the quarterly posting of the bulletin by the State Board of Accounts. And I think since it doesn't get mailed anymore, a lot of newer people aren't aware of this as much as they might be. And so I put this in my slide this year because it's something I'll often ask, did you look at the bulletin to see? And they're like, I didn't know there was one. So there's a bulletin out there that's published by the Board of Accounts quarterly, and it's a wonderful piece of knowledge. And this is where you find it electronically on their webpage. And the first page, I don't have my first page. Your very last page shows what that county bulletin looks like in the presentation. And the first page of it are important dates for that quarter. And I used to, when I would get that check, and mark on my calendar those important dates so that I didn't miss some of the little things like the sending the congressional school fund interest in, or some of those things that just don't happen very, very frequently. And it's just a good knowledge for you, a good calendar for you to use to set up that quarter. And then further in it, they have a lot of opinions that are questions that have been asked to them where they've given an answer, and so they publish that in their bulletin quarterly. It's a wealth of knowledge that I encourage all of you to look at and use. So I'm a little bit ahead. Does anybody have any questions?